A phone call from a man who doesn't exist.
An address that isn't real.
While William Wallace searches every street in Liverpool, asking strangers for help, someone is inside his home.
Crushing his wife's skull with 11 blows.
He returns to find her dead.
And the police? They find 0 blood on his clothes. The jury convicts him in under an hour.
Then Britain's highest court does something that's never been done before or since. They declare a murder conviction invalid because the evidence simply doesn't support it.
Wallace walks free. But here's what they didn't know. A garage mechanic had already found a blood-soaked glove in another man's car the night of the murder.
And that evidence never made it to trial.
No, because the real killer had family working inside the police department.
The detective who ran the investigation showed up drunk to the crime scene. The pathologist lied about when Julia died, twice changing his timeline to match the prosecution's theory.
A man spent months on death row for a murder he provably didn't commit.
While the actual killer lived freely for 5 decades, protected by the very people sworn to deliver justice.
And no one was ever punished for this.
Welcome to Whispers of Crime.
We're looking at one of the most frustrating, just chilling, and legally complex cases in British criminal history.
The murder of Julia Wallace in Liverpool, 1931. This is a story of, meticulous planning, scientific impossibility, and shocking institutional corruption.
Before we get into the facts, remember to follow Whispers of Crime on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and other podcast platforms for daily updates on every crime.
And subscribe to our YouTube channel, Whispers of Crime.
So to really understand the complexity here, we have to start with the people at its center.
William and Julia Wallace.
Yeah. They lived this very, very quiet life in Anfield, Liverpool at 29 Wolverton Street.
They seem like such unlikely people to be at the heart of this kind of brutal domestic tragedy.
They were. By all accounts, they were intensely private, really quite ordinary people in a totally unremarkable terraced house.
And Julia, she was the victim.
Julia Wallace. She was brutally murdered in January 1931. She was nearly 70, though a lot of the reports at the time mistakenly said she was younger.
And she was an accomplished pianist.
She was, yes. And she'd been married to William for 17 years.
So what about William Herbert Wallace? That man who was, ultimately accused. He was 52.
52, yeah. He was an insurance collections agent for Prudential Insurance. It was one of those jobs that, required him to walk a specific route, collecting these small weekly premiums from customers.
A very routine, methodical job.
It really was. And that kind of defined his personality. He was seen as mild-mannered, extremely quiet, a bit aloof.
Fusty, I think is the word the neighbors use.
That's the one, fusty. And that persona, this quiet, methodical nature, it became a huge factor later on in the court of public opinion.
It absolutely did. But his private life was actually quite different, wasn't it?
It was. It was quite rich. He was an autodidact, completely self-taught. He pursued these intellectual hobbies, chemistry, botany.
He even took up the violin.
He did, late in life, in 1928, specifically so he could accompany Julia's piano playing.
So these are not the traits of a simple or brutish man.
No, not at all. He was an intellectual, but he was in poor physical health. He'd had one kidney removed, and everyone knew him as a slow mover.
But his demeanor, that reserved, maybe cold demeanor, that was later interpreted as something else entirely.
It was seen as calculation, as a lack of emotion by a really hostile public.
And that difference between his private reality and how he was perceived, that seems to be the first of many just profound paradoxes in this case.
It is. The crime novelist Raymond Chandler, he called it the impossible murder.
And it's a label that sticks, right?
It really does, because of this fundamental paradox.
Yeah.
Almost every single fact in the evidence, from Wallace's movements to the items at the scene, it was all accepted by both the prosecution and the defense.
But every single fact could be interpreted in two completely opposite ways.
Exactly. It's like a perfectly balanced, unsolvable equation.
So let's go to the event that set this whole nightmare in motion. Monday evening, January 19th, 1931.
Right. Wallace's routine takes him to the Liverpool Central Chess Club. He was held at a place called the City Cafe on North John Street.
He was scheduled to play a tournament match.
He was. And then he didn't go all the time, maybe once every 2 weeks or so. He gets there that night around 7:45 p.m.
But the key event, the really crucial event, happened about 25 minutes before he even walked in the door.
The famous Qualtrough phone call.
Exactly.
At precisely 7:20 p.m., the club captain, a man named Samuel Beattie, he answers a call. The man on the line identifies himself as R.M. Qualtrough.
And Qualtrough has a request.
A very specific one. He insisted that Wallace visit him the very next evening, Tuesday, January 20th, at 7:30 p.m.
The purpose being to discuss an insurance policy.
Right, and he gives an address, 25 Menlove Gardens East, Liverpool.
Beatty, who took the call, he's a key witness here.
A huge one. He noted that Qualtrough had a strong, rather gruff voice, and he was later absolutely unshakable in his opinion.
That the voice was not William Wallace's.
Definitively not Wallace's.
That testimony from a man who knew Wallace well, who took the call firsthand, I mean, that's a massive piece of evidence in his favor.
It should have been. But the police, they just ignored it. They immediately jumped on one highly suspicious detail about where the call came from.
It was traced back to a public phone box.
And where was this phone box? Only 400 yards, about 370 meters, from Wallace's own home in Anfield, right near his usual tram stop.
So the prosecution's immediate theory, the one they stuck with through everything, was that Wallace himself made the call.
That he pretended to be Qualtrough, all to create this elaborate, supposedly watertight alibi for the next evening.
That became the cornerstone of their entire case, didn't it?
It did, but the logic is so flimsy when you think about it.
I mean, the defense pointed out the staggering number of things Wallace would have had to rely on for this alibi to even work.
Right. He only went to the club every other week. Why pick such a high-risk plan? Relying on the captain, Beatty, being there, remembering the message, passing it on correctly. It's just too many variables.
All that just to justify a trip away from home.
Seems unlikely. And the defense offered a much simpler but also much more chilling explanation for how a killer could have known Wallace would be there.
The notice board.
The notice board. Wallace's tournament schedule, including his specific matchup for that night, it was publicly displayed right next to the club's telephone. For weeks.
So anyone who knew the cafe or knew Wallace's routine could have easily known he was expected there on that specific Monday.
Exactly. If the murderer wasn't Wallace, then this call was a cold, deliberate, and incredible cunning ploy, using public information to draw the man away from his wife at a fixed time the very next night.
This is why the case is so frustrating. This duality. If Wallace made the call, he's a genius killer. If Qualtrough was real, it's just a stunning piece of criminal stagecraft.
So William Wallace, the next day, Tuesday, January 20th, he does exactly what Qualtrough asked. He leaves 29 Wolverton Street at about 6:45 p.m.
In the way he acts from this point on, it seems tailor-made to draw attention to himself. Was he trying to create an alibi, or was he just trying to do his job?
That's the question, isn't it? The journey itself was highly noticeable. Wallace traveled across town by 3 separate trams to get to the Mossley Hill district. It's far from Anfield.
And witnesses later testified that he asked a lot of people about the address.
Numerous people. The tram conductor, a local policeman, shop owners. He kept asking about 25 Menlove Gardens East. And he made a point of saying that he was a complete stranger to these parts.
Which was later used against him, of course. Painted him as a man consciously establishing his whereabouts.
Of course. But the reality of what he found there cemented the fact that the call was a setup.
The address didn't exist?
Simply didn't exist. There was a Menlove Gardens north, south, and west, all real established streets. But no Menlove Gardens East.
So he searched for 45 minutes.
Diligently. He even knocked on the door of 25 Menlove Gardens West, just trying to fulfill the request. He confirmed, very publicly, that the address and the client were both fictitious.
So at around 8:45 p.m., after wasting nearly 2 hours on this cold, frustrating, wild goose chase, Wallace comes home.
He gets back to Wolverton Street, and he finds the doors, both front and back, are locked.
He struggles to get in.
He does, which leads him to get his neighbors, John and Florence Johnston, to come over and witness his difficulty.
That detail is so important, isn't it? If he's the killer, why bring witnesses to watch you discover the scene?
It's another one of those contradictions. The prosecution said he was performing for them. The defense said his inability to get in proved someone else had locked up after leaving.
With the Johnstons watching, he finally gets the back door open.
He does. And what he found inside the parlor, the sitting room, it just defies the image of some kind of planned, clean crime.
Julia Wallace. She was found brutally bludgeoned to death.
The scene was one of just extreme, frenzied violence. She'd been struck an estimated 11 times with a heavy, blunt object.
Which was strongly suspected to be a missing fire poker from the room.
Yes, from the parlor grate. It was never found.
There was also an attempt at staging a robbery, but it felt clumsy.
Conspicuously clumsy.
Yeah.
A cash box that Wallace used for his insurance collections had been forced open, but the amount of money missing was tiny. A few pounds at most.
And nothing else was touched.
Critically, no. No other valuable items in the house, like silver or jewelry, were disturbed at all. It seemed less like a real robbery and more like a flimsy attempt to divert suspicion.
And then there's that bizarre detail, the Macintosh.
A Macintosh coat, presumably Wallace's, was found placed right under Julia's body.
Under the corpse.
Yes. The prosecution later used this to support their theory that the killer was trying to shield himself from blood.
Which brings us to the scientific impossibility. The piece of evidence that should have exonerated Wallace right there on the spot. The lack of blood.
Given the nature of the wounds. 11 frenzied, brutal blows. Forensic experts were unanimous.
The killer would have been covered in blood.
Heavily contaminated were the words they used. The velocity and the pattern of the spatter guaranteed it. Yet Wallace's suit, the one he wore that evening on his trip.
It was tested with the highly sensitive benzidine test.
And the test revealed
0. Absolutely no trace of bloodstains was found on the clothing Wallace had worn.
This is the moment the police narrative should have just collapsed. If Wallace did it, he would have been covered in his wife's blood. It's that simple.
But instead of looking for someone else, the police just became fixated. They had to explain away the missing blood.
Which led to the infamous naked killer theory.
It sounds absurd.
It is absurd, but this was their official position. Wallace must have committed the brutal murder completely naked, wrapped only in that Macintosh to shield himself. Then he washed himself perfectly clean, got dressed, and left for his tram journey.
But even if you accept that ludicrous scenario for a second, the evidence of a frantic cleanup just wasn't there.
It wasn't. The examination of the bathroom and the drains was thorough. They found no traces of blood, no sign of recent heavy use of the bath.
Nothing.
The only thing they found was a single tiny clot in the toilet pan. They claimed it was cross-contamination, but it was nowhere near the evidence you'd need to support the cleanup of a heavy bloodbath.
And the forensic issues are just compounded by the sheer physical impossibility of the timeline.
This all hinges on the testimony of one crucial witness, Alan Close, the local milk delivery boy.
He saw Julia alive.
He did. Close testified that he spoke to Julia Wallace on her doorstep sometime between 6:30 p.m. and 6:45 p.m.
And Wallace always maintained he left the house at 6:45 p.m.
Right, to walk to his 7:06 p.m. tram.
So if we accept that 6:45 p.m. time for both events, Wallace is left with an almost non-existent window of time.
Exactly. We're talking about an extremely narrow window, potentially 4 minutes maximum.
4 minutes. For an ailing 52-year-old man, known to be a slow mover, to do all of that.
To commit a frenzied 11-blow murder, completely undress, meticulously clean himself and the weapon, stage a robbery, get dressed again, and then appear completely composed to walk a third of a mile to the tram stop.
It's logistically impossible.
It really is.
The police must have known this was a critical weakness in their theory. How did they even try to get around it?
The investigative team was so determined to prove it, they took some, shocking measures.
They ran a test.
They did. They commissioned a fit young detective to sprint the distance from the house to the tram stop.
Yeah.
After mimicking the assumed motions of the crime.
A fit young detective. Not a 52-year-old man with one kidney.
Right. It was clearly impossible for Wallace to replicate, but the police used the detective's time as proof that the timeline was possible.
And the medical evidence, the supposed bedrock of the case, was just manipulated.
It was completely undermined. The original police estimate for the time of death, based on the early assessment, was around 8:00 p.m.
When Wallace was miles away in Mossley Hill.
Confirmed to be miles away. But as soon as Alan Close's testimony placed Julia alive later, the pathologist, with no new evidence, changed the time of death.
Twice.
He changed it twice. He eventually settled on just after 6 p.m. It was a transparent attempt to align the death with the only moment the prosecution suspect could have possibly committed the crime.
This deliberate twisting of critical medical facts, it just compromised the integrity of the entire investigation from the start.
Don't forget to follow Whispers of Crime on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and other podcast platforms for daily updates on every crime, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Whispers of Crime.
Like, share this episode with others who might have information about this case and help. Also, comment your suggestions below.
Drop your positive review and rating, and remember to check out our previous release bizarre and spooky episodes.
So despite all the scientific contradictions, the impossible timeline, the lack of any real cleanup evidence, the police focused solely on Wallace.
For 2 weeks, they ignored every other possible lead and arrested him on February 2nd, 1931.
And this singular focus, combined with just how bizarre the Qualtrough call was, it generated this immense, toxic amount of publicity.
The public opinion was already heavily biased against Wallace before the trial even began.
The local press published factual misstatements that favored the prosecution.
It effectively poisoned the jury pool, which was selected from nearby Liverpool towns. And Wallace's own personality, it worked against him.
His stoicism, his apparent lack of visible grief.
It contributed to this public perception that he was cold, calculating, and therefore guilty.
His intellectual pursuits were truly weaponized against him, weren't they? I mean, they turned a man who was quietly interested in chemistry into some kind of Machiavellian mastermind.
That's exactly right. His interest in chess was heavily exploited by the press and by the prosecution. They reported he was a master player with a mind trained to think ahead.
Using his supposed skill to imply he was cunning enough to devise this perfect crime with the phone call as his opening move.
Which was, ironically, completely untrue.
He was just an amateur.
He was a third-rate player, an enthusiastic duffer. His reputation as a chess genius was entirely fabricated for the media narrative, but the image stuck. The man who planned murder like a game of chess.
So the trial takes place at St. George's Hall in late April 1931. And the prosecution's case is built entirely on circumstantial evidence.
It is. It's predicated on that one central, unproven assumption that Wallace was Qualtrough.
The defense fought back hard on that point.
They did. On the principle of circumstantial evidence itself, they argued that it has to exclude every reasonable possibility other than the defendant's guilt.
And the judge, Mr. Justice Wright, he seemed to agree with them.
He really did. His summation at the end of the trial was incredibly strong, and it heavily favored an acquittal.
He called the case almost unexampled in the annals of crime.
He did. And he emphasized to the jury the fatal flaw in the prosecution's logic. He said, the question is not, who did this crime? The question is, did the prisoner do it? He warned them not to assume guilt just because they couldn't imagine another killer.
Despite that crystal clear judicial instruction to apply reasonable doubt, the jury came back remarkably quickly.
In a little more than an hour, the Liverpool jury found William Wallace guilty.
And they sentenced him to death by hanging.
It was a verdict driven entirely by societal pressure, by prejudice against his cold demeanor, and by the sensationalism of the press. It just overrode all the factual and scientific impossibilities that had been raised.
So Wallace, an insurance agent, is now awaiting execution for a murder he seemingly had no time, no opportunity, and no physical capacity to commit.
Which brings us to the historic appeal. It was heard just 3 weeks later, May 19, 1931, before the Court of Criminal Appeal.
And they recognized the monumental injustice immediately.
They did. The prosecution's case was systematically dismantled, focusing on that fundamental flaw of circular reasoning.
Lord Chief Justice Hewart delivered the critical challenge, didn't he?
He did. He said to the prosecutor, "You use as a step in your argument that which is only consolidated when your argument is complete."
In other words, their whole case was circular.
Exactly. They were saying, Wallace must be Qualtrough because his actions were suspicious, and his actions were suspicious because only Qualtrough could have planned them.
And when you expose that circular logic, the whole thing collapses.
It fell apart. The conviction was quashed. The court ruled that the verdict cannot be supported, having regard to the evidence.
And this judgment was monumental.
It was, and it remains, the first time in British legal history that a murder conviction was overturned solely on the basis of insufficient evidence. Not because of a legal mistake or new evidence, but simply because the prosecution had completely failed to prove its case.
What a profound admission of institutional error. For the highest court to take such an unprecedented step, it just highlights how truly flimsy the case against him was.
Wallace was saved from the gallows, but the real killer was never pursued.
And this is where we have to turn our attention to the alternative suspect. The man Wallace himself had begun to suspect, and the evidence that was actively suppressed by the authorities.
For decades, William Wallace's name was tainted, despite the appeal. But as time went on, research began to point a relentless finger at a different man,
Richard Gordon Parry.
Richard Gordon Parry.
Who was he, and why did he immediately become a far more compelling suspect?
Richard Gordon Parry, born in 1909, so he is much younger than Wallace, in his early 20s at the time of the murder.
He was known to be reckless.
Very reckless. Constantly short of money, trying to live a lavish lifestyle he couldn't afford. And crucially, he was a former prudential colleague of William Wallace.
So he had a motive, and it was linked directly to Wallace's insurance collections.
It was. Parry had briefly worked with Wallace in 1928-1929. And during that time, Wallace learned that Parry was dishonest.
He wasn't paying in all the premiums he collected.
Exactly. Parry had left Prudential under a shadow, and his father had to step in and cover some of the shortfall.
So he has a financial motive. He knows Wallace keeps cash in a box at home. And he has a motive to silence Wallace if he's afraid of being exposed.
Absolutely. And what's more, Parry was acquainted with Julia. He occasionally visited the house on Wolverton Street, apparently to sing for her. He knew the house, the routine, the schedule.
It makes him a far more plausible candidate for making that phone call than some random killer.
It does. And the police, they did initially interview Parry.
They saw him as a suspect.
He was quickly identified as a prime suspect, but he seemed to have an unshakable alibi, and they dismissed him very quickly, focusing all their resources on Wallace.
And this quick dismissal, later analysis shows it was probably less about the evidence and more about powerful connections.
This is where the incompetence shifts into what looks like active obstruction of justice. The research done by Roger Wilkes in the 1980s is what really blew this open.
He uncovered evidence that should have convicted Parry decades earlier.
He did. It involves Parry's movements on the night of the murder. On Tuesday, January 20th, after Julia was murdered, Parry took his car to a local garage.
And what did he do there?
He used a high-pressure hose to wash down his car, which is, highly suspicious behavior for a routine cleaning job. But more damningly, the garage mechanic later testified in confidence about what he saw.
He saw that one of his gloves was soaked in blood.
A bloody glove, belonging to the strongest alternate suspect found in his car on the night of the murder.
And this evidence was just suppressed.
Completely. It never made it into the trial documentation. Wilkes argued persuasively that this was directly enabled by corruption within the Liverpool establishment.
Parry's father.
Parry's father was a significant official within the Liverpool Corporation. It suggests powerful family connections that extended into high-level police ties.
So the police weren't just incompetent. They were actively colluding to shield the son of an influential local figure, even if it meant sacrificing an innocent man.
It seems so. The pressure to get a conviction in such a high-profile case combined fatally with this institutional bias. It was easier to push the narrative of the cold, weird insurance man than to cross powerful local figures.
And Parry's alibi, it was shaky from the very beginning.
It was inconsistent. He initially relied on his fiancée, Lily Lloyd, for an alibi for the time of the phone call.
Placing him away from the phone box.
Right. But after Wallace's acquittal, Parry jilted her, and she, devastated, allegedly offered to swear to Wallace's solicitor that her alibi had been completely false.
So the alibi for the Qualtrough call was a lie. But he also had a second alibi, a different one, for the time of the murder itself.
Yes, and this is where it gets complicated again, reflecting that impossible murder paradox. Later police statements revealed a woman named Olivia Brine swore Parry was at her house from 5:30 to 8:30 p.m. on the night of the murder.
If that's true, it makes Parry's involvement impossible.
Just like the Milk Boy's testimony made Wallace's involvement impossible.
So how do we reconcile these conflicting alibis with the suppressed evidence of the bloody glove?
The current consensus, especially given the suppression of physical evidence, is that Parry's various alibis were likely manipulated or just plain false, relying on his father's influence.
The police had a physical piece of evidence pointing to Parry, and they chose to ignore it.
They chose to ignore it and chase the circumstantial theory against Wallace instead. The corruption suggests the police were never truly interested in who did it, only in getting a conviction fast.
And the later behavior of Richard Gordon Parry himself, even decades later, it suggests he knew a lot more than he ever let on.
It's an extraordinary detail.
Yeah.
In 1966, two crime writers, Jonathan Goodman and Richard Whittington Egan, they located Parry and confronted him.
What happened?
Parry displayed this astonishingly detailed knowledge of the case, not just the main facts, but of obscure witnesses who had died in the years since. When they asked him to talk about the murder, he flatly refused. He boasted he wouldn't for any amount of money.
Which isn't proof of guilt, but it certainly suggests a deep fear of exposure.
A deep fear, or at the very least, intimate involvement in major crime he was a prime suspect in.
So let's just balance the arguments one last time. The most robust modern theory is that Parry, using his knowledge of Wallace in the house, masterminded the call.
Right. Intending to rob the cash box. Julia resisted, and the situation escalated into a brutal murder with the fire poker.
That theory fits the suppressed evidence, the bloody glove, the most cleanly.
It does. But we have to acknowledge the counterpoint, which was famously championed by the crime novelist P.D. James.
She was fascinated by this case, and she believed Wallace was still the killer.
She did. James agreed that Parry probably made the phone call, but she speculated it was just a cruel prank. Revenge for Wallace knowing about his past dishonesty.
And her argument was statistical. The coincidence of a prankster and a murderer acting on the same night was just too great to believe.
Right. She concluded that Wallace seized the opportunity that the prank call created, used it to establish his alibi, and then committed the murder.
But her theory struggles with the same fatal flaw that destroyed the prosecution's case. The forensic evidence.
The complete lack of blood on Wallace's clothes, the impossible timeline. It remains logically irreconcilable with the brutality of the crime.
The overwhelming weight of evidence, especially the suppressed material about Parry, it all points away from William Wallace.
The fact that the police actively covered up the bloody glove strongly suggests they knew who the real killer was.
William Wallace was freed in May 1931, the first man in British legal history to gain freedom from a murder conviction because the evidence was just deemed insufficient. But his life after that was short and profoundly sad.
He returned to Liverpool. He tried to resume his old life. He went back to work at Prudential, even went back to the chess club at the City Cafe.
But the public had already convicted him.
He was shunned, ostracized. He was subjected to a campaign of hatred.
The negative press coverage just ensured that public opinion stayed firmly against him. They were convinced he was a calculating killer who had simply gotten away with it.
He received constant hate mail, physical threats. His private diaries, which were later reviewed, they reveal his profound anguish, his grief for Julia.
It sounds like he exchanged a death sentence for a life sentence of isolation and torment.
He was broken by it all. He eventually took a clerical job and moved away to Bromborough. His diaries also documented his growing private belief that a former colleague, an obvious reference to Parry, was the killer.
And he feared the real killer might murder him too.
He did. Tragically, Wallace died less than 2 years after his acquittal, in February 1933. He was just 54.
He died from his chronic kidney ailments.
A condition that was certainly made worse by the stress and trauma of spending months on death row. A colleague later said Wallace had declined an operation that might have prolonged his life. It suggests he had little left to live for.
The Wallace case, it remains this open wound in the history of British justice. It's a terrible symbol of systemic failure, how institutional bias can condemn an innocent man while protecting the guilty.
The failures are just layered and shocking. First, you have a murder conviction founded entirely on mere suspicion and public prejudice.
Second, the fundamental forensic and medical evidence was twisted and manipulated.
The pathologist changing the time of death twice just to fit the suspect. And then the ultimate failure. Critical evidence of an alternate suspect, the bloody glove in Parry's car, was actively suppressed by the police.
This was a case where the immense publicity just compelled the Liverpool police to get a conviction at any cost.
And it led them to persecute an innocent man for 2 years while ignoring and hiding leads that pointed directly toward the actual killer, Richard Gordon Parry, who lived freely for 5 more decades, dying in 1980, never facing justice.
The Wallace case remains officially unsolved. It lives up to that description. A mental exercise that ends in perpetual check, where every piece of evidence supports 2 completely incompatible ideas: the calculated killer or the protected killer.
Julia Wallace's murder was planned with extraordinary cunning. But the legal and institutional failures that followed demonstrate that sometimes the injustice of the system can far outweigh the cleverness of the crime itself.
William Wallace's suffering and conviction were the terrible result of that failure, and Julia's killer was never held accountable.
If you want more in-depth analysis on true crime cases like this, follow Whispers of Crime on your preferred platform, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, or wherever you listen.
You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel for daily updates. We encourage you to engage with this material.
Drop your positive review and rating, and share this story of injustice. You can also comment your suggestions below. Remember to check out our previous releases. covering bizarre and spooky episodes.
Julia Wallace was brutally murdered nearly a century ago. If you possess any documentation or knowledge pertaining to the suppressed evidence involving Richard Gordon Parry or the actions of the Liverpool police in 1931, the pursuit of justice continues.
Please contact Whispers of Crime with any information. Thank you for listening.